It's one of my favorite times of year, and that's when I finally get to start my seeds indoors. Today we're going to talk about 5 essential things to know when starting seeds indoors. And the first of 5 essential things to know when starting seeds indoors is to use a seed starting mix. Don't use garden soil. Don't use compost. Don't use potting mix that goes into containers. Use a seed starting mix. The reason to use seed starting mix is in the simplicity of its benefits. It's not packed with nutrients. It doesn't have tons of fertilizers in it. It doesn't have anything that is going to promote growth. What it's going to do is it's going to provide a nice neutral medium that is sterile, that is aerated, and that holds a good bit of water. These components are key in the beginning stages of the life cycle of the plants that you're going to be growing. Seeds already have all the energy that they need. They don't need a boost from fertilizers, so you don't want to put them into potting soil that has fertilizers added. The fertilizer will do pretty much nothing at best, and at worst, it can harm your seeds. It can actually burn them by being a little bit too strong on the fertilizer. So use a neutral medium when starting your seeds. Once they've sprouted and you're ready to pot them up, then you can start to fertilize. You can either buy these commercially or you can make your own, and I recommend that you do that. You can make it with 3 simple ingredients. It's less than half the price of what you can buy bagged in the stores. It's super easy to make, and there's actually a pretty compelling case from a sustainability standpoint, using coco coir instead of peat moss. A seed starting mix that you make on your own can be sustainable, affordable, and customizable. You can make it however you want it. You can put things in it that are important to you. You can create your own ratios. That's why I recommend that you make your own seed starting mix. The next essential thing to know when starting your seeds indoors is what vessel you're going to grow your seeds in. Probably 95% of the time, I'm starting my seeds in cells. I do this because it's super easy then to pot these up. So once the seeds have emerged and I can pot them up into a larger pot, I can transplant these in a much more straightforward fashion than if I were to have started the seeds in a tray. Now, you could just take this tray here and you could fill it with your seed starter mix. You could broadcast some seeds over top, or you can have little quadrants that set aside different types of seeds, and you can grow a bunch of different plants, start them at least, in the same tray. But then once they start to emerge, you're going to have to thin them out. You're also going to have to eventually get the seedlings into their own pots. This process, called pricking out the seedlings, can be a little bit time consuming, and it can also be a tad difficult because these are delicate seedlings. You want to make sure that you're not doing anything to interrupt the growing process. You don't want to harm the roots, you don't want to harm the stems or the leaves, so you have to be super careful. That's why I choose the cells, because I don't ever have to touch the plant after it emerges. After it emerges, all I do is I remove them from these cells to pot them up into larger pots that eventually I'll take outside to harden them off and then plant them into the ground. Now that we know the growing medium that we're using and the vessel that we're using to start the seeds, let's get the seeds started. Fill your cells to the brim with your seed starting mix. Make sure that your seed starting mix is well moistened before you put it into the cells. After filling up your cells, it's as easy as taking the seeds that you're planning on sowing and putting 1 or more into each cell. I find that if I'm using brand new seeds, I only put 1 per cell and I have a pretty strong germination rate. If I'm using seeds that I've saved from years before, I'll probably put 2 or 3 seeds into each cell. That way, I can be relatively confident that I'm going to get germination from at least 1 of the seeds. If I end up getting more than 1, then that's fine. I can choose to thin them out and just keep the one that looks strongest, or I can prick out the extra seedlings and put them into their own pots. It's also important to remember that these seeds are going to become plants, and these plants are going to bear fruit, and this fruit is something that you want to harvest throughout the growing season. So make sure that when you're starting seeds, you have a plan for outside, because eventually you're going to be taking these outside. And you don't want to encounter a situation where you have taken care of and loved 15 pepper plants only to find that you have room for 3. Now that your seeds are sown, you've created almost a perfect environment for them to germinate. Almost. Which leads us to the next essential thing to know when starting seeds indoors. Adding a dome to your tray. Putting a dome on top of the tray after sowing the seeds does a great job at trapping in moisture. You want to create a nice, humid environment for these seeds in order for them to germinate. So a great way to help the soil heat up and help your plants germinate is by using a heat mat. These heat mats work perfectly placed underneath your seed starting trays. And the great thing about them too is that you can buy an accessory and it will turn the heat mat on or off based on what the temperature of your soil is. So you can set it for 80 degrees, 85 degrees, and be confident that your soil is going to remain at that temperature. And then as soon as you start to see signs of germination, remove the dome. The dome has done its job. It provided a warm, humid environment for your seeds to germinate. Now that they've germinated, you want to eliminate humidity. You don't want these tender leaves to be wet. If they're wet, that's going to promote mold. It's not going to be a good thing for your seedlings. And now that your seedlings have germinated, they need light. What many people who grow seeds indoors use as their light source, myself included, are grow lights. Grow lights have become pretty ubiquitous in the marketplace, and you can actually find some pretty affordable options online or at your local big box store. What you're doing here is you're avoiding your seedlings from going leggy. Have you ever noticed if you try to grow a plant that needs more sunlight than you can give it, it ends up stretching really long, reaching for the sun? This is what we call going leggy. The stems get really long, they're not very strong, and the plants suffer for it. So what we do to combat that issue when we're growing our seedlings is we put the light source as close as possible as we can to the plant without risking injuring the plant by burning the leaves. So once your seedlings have germinated, remove the dome, put them under light, put the light really close to the leaves, and then continue to check on them every single day, making sure that you raise the light every so often so the leaves don't end up reaching and actually touching the light bulb itself. And the fifth essential thing to know when starting seeds indoors is to bottom water. Bottom watering is exactly what it sounds like. You're watering from the bottom. You're actually pouring water into the tray that your cells are in, rather than pouring water over the top of the plants. What this does is a couple things. It helps prevent mold. Remember, we don't want the leaves to be wet. That's why we removed the dome. Too wet of an environment promotes mold, which you definitely don't want. Also, remember that these are brand new plants that have very tender stems. If you top water these plants, there's a good chance that you're going to put undue stress on them. You might end up injuring the stems or even breaking them, and then you would have to start all over. So instead, bottom water. It's the healthiest and safest way to give your seedlings the water that they need. Now there's a lot more that we could get into when it comes to starting seeds, but these are the essentials. These are the things that I recommend you do in order to successfully start seeds indoors. Happy growing.